Last year, I made a video about chivalry. The ins and outs of what was an important part of medieval society. I've also dealt with two knights, William de Braose and William Longsby, but it got me thinking. Of all my videos, I've neglected the very chaps who put chivalry into practice in the first place. The knights themselves. Most likely because they're already something we are familiar with. I mean, the average person can conjure images of dashing knights on horseback, clad in shining armour, armed with lances and swords, and their coat of arms adorned on their shield. We know what knights are. Whether we imagine a romanticised Arthurian version, probably fighting a dragon like St. George, probably rescuing a damsel locked up in some tower, or maybe a more grounded version, the grizzled veteran in well-used armour, with rust at the edges, sword, many notches, telling of a campaign. But the aristocracy of the 15th century was a far cry from the mercenaries of the 11th century. Most weren't Templars heading to the Holy Land, but the militia of a local lord. Many were brutes, others icons of virtue. But before we continue, I'm going to have to explain what a knight isn't, so we can get a better picture of what one is, which was first and foremost a specific kind of military elite, requiring not just years of training, but inducted via a ritual ceremony. And I'm not going to be dealing with every soldier in history who ever rode a horse, because as similar as they were, samurai were not knights, nor were Roman cavalry or the Mongol hordes. Also, I'll be concentrating on the high to late medieval periods, as sure, Charlemagne had paladins, a type of knight, in the 8th to 9th centuries, but the concept of these was added much later. The horsemen who actually rode with Charlemagne were nothing like the fully armoured chaps with lance and shield. One last thing, a more controversial point from our modern perspective. Knighthood was a boys' club, meaning knights were men. And before you bring up Joan of Arc, I'll stress, wearing armour does not make you a knight. Joan of Arc was a peasant. Peasants were not nobility. She was never knighted. Even Eleanor of Aquitaine and her ladies during the Second Crusade were not knights, even though they took the cross and rode on horseback with lances, in ceremony at least. They were never knights. The closest we get is the Order of the Hatchet, and even that was honorary, because again, wearing armour and fighting on horseback does not make you a knight. A specific ritual knighting ceremony after around a decade of training made you a knight, and it was strictly for the boys. I'm not saying women are not good in a scrap, of course they are. I'm just separating actual ritually belted knights from the regular chaps who did similar. Yeah, and in later times, the term knight evolves, becoming something completely different. But Brian May, Elton John and Patrick Stewart don't qualify as knights either in the context of the topic. Okay, so Patrick Stewart gets a free pass because he plays Leo deGrance in Excalibur, but still, he's hardly going to be fighting in the retinue of Richard I, even if he had a time machine. So now we know what they're not. What are knights? Well, like I said earlier, knights were first and foremost a specific kind of military elite, trained from a young age and honed to a high degree of skill. The word itself is a Germanic word that pretty much just means servant, knecht. But no noble in England, France, or anywhere on the continent would use it, because they all spoke a variation of French, so they'd be using the word chevalier, which means horseman. Hence we get the word chivalry, the etiquette of the chevalier. From there, the concept of the knights begin around the mid-11th century, but as I said earlier, the knights of William the Conqueror were a far cry from the knights of the 15th century, but they were also remarkably different from those of the 12th, not just in appearance, but in customs, ideology and background. As it's not as fully formed as we'd imagine it to be, it's still an early concept, constantly evolving. The rituals of knighthood were not the elaborate affairs you'd see in the 14th and 15th century. One thing is sure though. It's becoming increasingly a career of the rich and powerful. Armour, horses and weapons simply are not cheap. Naturally, this means that those becoming knights are going to have money. Meaning knights, by default, were already forming long-established aristocratic families by the mid to late 12th century. Barons and earls were knights, first and foremost. Even the king was a knight, and went through the same training. So, by around the mid to late 12th century, it was already a given. You'd be born into the nobility. Your father would be a knight. You'd be familiar with a military environment. You'd be used to the hustle and bustle of military activity. Even your house was a military installation, as that was a castle's main function. These places were not built with luxury in mind. Bit of a pickle, these. Just getting up and down a spiral staircase in wet weather couldn't be a pig, given you're most likely wearing turn shoes. You can only get one person up and down at a time, so there must have been a system to ease this. I can imagine people calling out, "Coming down," with a right of way or something. I'm not saying there was, just there must have been some system in place. The same way as there must have been a rule to prevent the children running around like a hyperactive squirrel. Anyway, you'd be used to having people around you, as your father's household would be busy indeed. Aside from your mother and father and your siblings, you've got the staff, from the steward to the serfs. Then you've got the meunier, which are the household knights who serve your father, all bedecked in his livery. It could be just a handful of men, around 50 like the Salisbury meunier. It could be hundreds. You might also be used to a garrison, regular soldiers hired to protect the castle. So yes, growing up, this would be second nature to you. Even before you began training, you'd know general etiquette, as well as reading, though probably not writing, but you'd certainly know scripture. You'd be familiar with games like chess. Not to mention, you'll already be familiar with horses. You'd typically begin your training as a knight around 8 years of age, sent off to the household of a relative, another knight, possibly a baron. Ideally quite a long distance away. For instance, the English preferred to send their children to Normandy, away from direct relatives and familiar ties. There you'd grow up in the service of that lord, and there you'd learn all the skills you'd need to become a military elite horseman. Actually, let's get into horses, as horsemanship is absolutely vital to the knight. You pretty much live in the saddle, whether travelling, hunting or at war. Even if you occasionally fight on foot, a horse is what makes you, you. And you typically own 3 horses. For general riding, you'd use a palfrey, a standard good all-rounder. It's from this horse you get the term hack, from Hackney. You'd also have a sumpter, or pack horse, that carried all the baggage. This includes your armour. Then you had the charger, usually a Rouncy, especially for low-ranking knights, but often you'll see some of the legendary destriers, war horses specifically bred with battle in mind. Aggressive buggers. And destriers were expensive, worth around 40 palfreys. And these horses had to be strong, as they would be carrying a fully armoured knight into battle, around 40 kilograms of armour and weaponry, depending on the period, plus the weight of the man himself. Big buggers. There were other horses, like the coursers and hobbies, and some knights owned many a horse, but tackling the many horse breeds, that's a whole other subject. But I will say that it's the Arabian horses that are considered the best, so not much has changed there. Right, let's get into training, because your training would also involve armour, as you'll need to be able to wear mail like a second skin. It'll be highly expensive and tailored to you, so your body will be covered from head to toe in metal. Over this went your surcoat, which, depending on your station, may also have your personal coat of arms. This is the classic knight, completed with the iconic Great Helm. In later times, it gets a lot more complicated. In my case, the arms are of Reginald Fitzpiers, the Baron of Blaenhinvi in Wales. Though he himself is not Welsh, he's very much a Norman invader. And if you've seen the William de Braose video, then you'll know that de Braose's lands were given to a knight called Piers Fitzherbert. Well, that is this chap's father. It's a long line of Norman knights who've all gone through the rigours of training. But as for the armour, as I said, it's heavy, but harnessed right, the weight is distributed, so contrary to popular belief, you can move well. You are mobile. You are not some lumbering stock character from a cartoon, but an elite warrior feared by many. You can fight. I will also add that often the horse is armoured and bedecked in livery. From atop your horse, you'll learn the art of the lance, a 10 to 12 foot spear made of ash wood, couched under your arm. And these do not splinter on impact as you see in the movies or reenactments, but the speed and momentum will create enough force to smash through pretty much anything. Yes, they still often broke, but not before turning your opponent into a shish kebab. For instance, when a young Edward Longshanks lowers his lance and drives his retinue into well over 1,000-foot soldiers in the Battle of Lewes, he breaks them utterly, like a hot knife through butter. Unfortunately, he drove them off the field so thoroughly he carried on running them down, which cost his father, King Henry III, the battle. Simply put, a few hundred knights charging headlong are a terrifying sight. Many simply lost courage and broke, rather than face the impact. But a lance isn't your primary weapon. That honour belongs to the arming sword, which is also a status symbol, properly weighed and belted, good for fighting atop a horse once you've ditched your lance. You'll also be trained in a whole host of weaponry, all part of the constant arms race during the Middle Ages in Europe, from falchions to axes. If it can take your opponent down, use it. But of course, the armour is keeping up, especially in the 14th to 15th centuries, where plate is the order of the day. First worn over your mail, until eventually replacing it altogether. As I say, it's an arms race. Right, once you've completed all this training, you'll graduate with the ritual ceremony. You could be 16 years old, you could be 20, but you've completed the training nonetheless. Often, knights will be created en masse, especially in times of war, like what happened to William Marshall, in which they are little more than battlefield commissions, while others are highly elaborate affairs, involving silk tunics, ritual baths, and anointing oils. And these belting rituals were growing more elaborate with each century. But regardless of how elaborate, they all had a few things in common. Naturally, there are religious elements, and you swore fealty to God, in this case the Trinity. As Martin Luther, No, the other one. Jesus Christ, not his father, the other one. Yes, that's the chap. He's not around yet, so all religious elements are of a Catholic nature. Either way, you get the idea. There'll be a brief religious element. Then you have the dubbing. Now, dubbing isn't a tap on the shoulder with a sword. That malarkey won't be around for a lot later. A different age. Here, dubbing comes from the term aduba, meaning to arm. As this is where your lord, usually a baron, not always the king, handed you your sword belt of office. Then the belt was girded to your body, strapped in, and you'd receive your armour proper. Some, like William Marshall, would also be given a nice cloak. Others had a lot more gifts given to them, including horses. Then you'd receive the collé, which is a hard blow to the body, or a backhand round the face, and this is the last blow you'll ever receive without retaliation. Now, finally, after all this, you're a fully belted knight, one of the elite. And there's only one way to celebrate this, and it's obligatory, and that is a colossal pig out in the feasting hall. And depending on your family's wealth, this could be a meagre pig out with just, say, 50 or so people and 30 dozen dishes, or it could be something the size of a Greek wedding. I'll also say another thing. Contrary to popular belief, knights weren't sporting many beards, especially in France where being clean-shaven was the norm. Among the Anglo-Norman knights, a moustache may be sported, but nail and beards are not good bedfellows, even if there is fabric underneath. Muslim spies would often shave their beards and blend in with the Crusaders, and unkempt, dishevelled Crusaders have often been mistaken for Muslims and slain by Christian forces. They've gassed my flabber. Either way, you're now a knight. So, now you're a knight. Now what? What happens next will be very familiar with anyone who's gone to university or left military service, as it depends on what your connections are and what contacts you've made. These days you could end up working in security or going into business with some of the people around you. You could end up getting jobs in the university itself, or in the company of one of the people you met along the way. There are many options. Same now as it was then. Your family could have a career all lined up for you. Your father could be the Earl of Cookiniensis. You could be joining his minier. This would be the ideal path for most knights, especially if you were the heir to the title and the lands. In this case, you'll one day be a baron, or even the next king. But this was for the top level of society. Most would be forming or joining mercenary bands, which takes us back to the blurring of lines between the 11th century chaps and the ones from the 12th and 13th centuries. This is where you see men like Fawkes de Brou, who is often referred to as a mercenary, before acquiring lands and titles. There were many knights like him who wandered Europe and the Holy Lands, seeking for coin and hire. Many French knights were hired by English kings like John and his son Henry III, loyal to the last against their own countrymen, only switching sides due to fealty to the French king, then switching back. Simon de Montfort himself was a French knight. The same went for English knights joining the French. Knights in Normandy and Aquitaine frequently played both sides, depending on who was winning. One Poitevin knight, after failing to kidnap the English queen, became an outlaw before fleeing to the Holy Land, where he ended up becoming the King of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan. So yes, it was often just down to luck. I'll give an example. The famous William Marshall ends up in the minier of the Earl of Salisbury, Patrick. But Patrick is slain just 2 years later, and the Marshal is on his own. Oh, and Guy de Lusignan was behind this also. This was where he tried to kidnap the Queen. Look at this procession. You'll see people in armour,
many with heraldry and many without, all were marching to their fate at the Battle of Evesham. These are the men of Simon de Montfort. They know they are marching to the deaths, but part of being a knight is loyalty and fealty. They chose to go down fighting with their lord. All a part of the cult of chivalry. That is what a knight's all about. So you kind of get the gist. But there was also another way for knights to earn coin and renown. The tournament circuit. What had emerged as a method to control and prevent the increasing amount of knights from tearing up the place in peacetime had evolved into a series of organised events where unemployed knights could find money and renown. Tournaments were held frequently all over the place, across various kingdoms, from Normandy to France, Flanders, even England. And one of the major circuits was the one at Le Mans. And by frequently, I'm talking pretty much every few weeks. Well-organised circuits, with knights travelling from one to another. Often this was their life, akin to sportsmen in our own time, complete with the equivalent of pit teams, animal handlers, armour repairmen and apothecaries, a treasurer, as well as someone to keep the books on who owned what ransom. The tournament itself would have one main big day, where there would be the main event, a large free-for-all melee. But there would be other smaller events held into the lead-up, initially just warm-up tilts, but eventually these would become the norm. Because in the earlier years of the 12th century, these are not the one-on-one tilt-style jousts that you are familiar with, but mock battles involving hundreds, if not thousands of knights, conducted over multiple fields. And even though the tilt-style jousts became the norm, the melee was still a favourite, enduring well into the early Renaissance, and much better organised. But teams wouldn't just race to a dog pile in the middle. They would often hide, conduct ambushes over the acres of fields. They'd group up to take out single knights who were easy pickings, all the while trying not to become a prisoner themselves. And more importantly, protect your lord. It was also not just for the lowly Ronin-style knights. Many barons attended these tournaments. They are the ones running the whole scene. Even kings attend tournaments, as they are also knights. In later times, Henry VIII would love a joust, and this is his armour. Unfortunately, he almost gets killed in a jousting accident, which cripples his leg. Though death is rare, it still happens, because these events are often dangerous. And it is not guaranteed money, but a gamble. It all revolves around the concept of ransom, because you're not killing each other, you're capturing one another, and then sending the bill to the family. A lot of money is changing hands. But many knights do end up in crippling debts. Though, if you've got what it takes, if you're good in a tournament circuit, you could end up rich. Stinking rich. Of course, the tournaments were controversial. They were often banned, but go ahead they did. The perfect pastime for the elite military of the feudal system. Also remember that knights weren't just the elite military. They also ran the kingdom. So imagine a world where your politicians were primarily trained at elite academies like Sandhurst or West Point or Saint-Cyr. As being a knight was not cheap, you needed money, ideally hailing from a family with a good pedigree. The highest ranking knight is the king. Below him are the barons, the men elected to carry out the word of the king. Civil servants would be members of the clergy, taking order from the barons. So even a low-ranking knight would be meeting with barons, and possibly even the king. So more importantly, you'd learn how to conduct yourself, as you don't want to show yourself up in public. Still, don't assume this was an absolute. There are many tales of people losing tempers, having fights, even drawing swords and attacking each other while at the king's court, especially once the wine got flowing. So they've still got a long way to go until they reach the gentlemanly etiquette of Patrick Stewart and Brian May. And no, I'm not including Elton John here, because he's famous for his tantrums. To quote the movie Rocket Man, he's been a since 1975. Yeah, he'd be right at home in the Middle Ages. But that's how politics was back in the medieval times. It was often unpleasant and aggressive. That's just how things were. And the governments of the high to late Middle Ages were run by these chaps. So anyone says war would end when you send politicians into battle, no, far from it. Because we've already been down that road before. So, these are the basics. This is what you'd expect to encounter if you were, say, in the era of William Marshall. Of course there are nuances. Of course there are exceptions. And of course things change. I can hear people in the comments contradicting me here and pulling me there. After all, I've not got into Templars and the like. No, not just yet, but there will be time. These are just the basics. There is a heck of a lot more to Knights that I could possibly go into here, but it gives me a base to expand on. Many people consider the military of the 10th century as Knights. Many would consider the French gendarmes of the 15th century Knights. While sure, they certainly looked the part, and were certainly nobility, they were more a professional army that wasn't a part of the feudal age which I'm discussing here. Times by then were changing. I'll also go back to the women, like Joan of Arc, like the Order of the Hatchet, because times were absolutely changing. The bygone era of chivalry has become just that. Bygone. By the 16th century, the idea of noble lancers charging into battle in heavy armour atop a horse had begun to fade out, evolve, just as the mercenaries of the 11th century paved the way for the flamboyant elites of the 13th. Black powder and shot, cannons and muskets. They would make short work of those that once ruled the battlefield of old. Rank upon rank of pikes, and eventually the rifle and bayonet. War was very different. Even though horses were used by the chaps in the trenches of the Great War, long gone were those noblemen clad in armour. But if anything, the same ideals had carried on, just not on the ground, but in the air. The Knights of the Skies, who pretty much had their own ideals, akin to a code of chivalry. But that is another story. For now, thank you for watching.